Yields back. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you. I very much enjoyed my time on House Administration and on the Subcommittee on Elections. Boy, what a difference there is when you change from Democrats to Republicans, right? You were not there, ranking member, but the chair and I sat through many a hearing when we talked about how wonderful it was that we had actually had an increase in voter participation in 2020. And my thought was, why don't we get very excited about that and make it easier and make sure that more Americans vote, right? Because that is democracy. We just celebrated the 4th of July. We should make it easier for American citizens to vote. And instead, we have this bill, which would make it harder for American citizens to vote. So you wonder why. Is it because the 2020 general election featured both the most Americans voting, but the Republican candidate lost? You know, because this bill goes after the communities that helped President Biden win. For example, polling of military personnel in 2020 showed that they didn't trust Trump as commander-in-chief, and many were shifting from voting Republican to voting for Biden. Mr. Chair, I'd like to enter into the record the 2020 NBC article. Trump says the military will vote for him, but he lost their support long ago. Trump treats the armed forces as just another entity he can manipulate for political purposes. That's alienated the troops and the top brass alike, close quote.
Without objection.
So this bill would make it harder for military personnel to sign up and vote. Our men and women in uniform, you know, they give up so much. They travel, they're away from home, it's not easy to vote. And you touched upon this earlier, ranking member, but what's your reaction when you see Republicans making it harder for military to vote? And do you see any good reason in treating our military that way?
I can, I think I articulated the barriers that would exist, and it's certainly not only for the military, although it does raise a number of questions, but just the kind of burdens that would now be placed on people simply to register to vote when there is scant evidence that there is any concern, despite what people say. There's not a concerted effort that I'm aware of to have non-U.S. citizens register, because frankly, you'd be putting them in harm's way. Just the registration is illegal, and certainly voting is subject to criminal penalties as well as deportation. It simply doesn't happen. In fact, the George Mason study, which was referenced, has been completely debunked by experts in the field of statistical survey data, and it's been debunked by so many different experts. And in the decade since the report was published, its authors have not published a defense of their research work, and nothing has made it through a peer review that survives any serious scrutiny. So there is, despite, you know, anybody can put out a paper, I guess, but when it's debunked by experts who looked at the survey data, I think it begs the question. And when you don't, and when you don't rebut that criticism, I think that says a great deal. But this, to your point, and I think this is a really important point, which is the problem in America is not too many people voting, it's that participation still lags behind. I mean, when half of the eligible people in an American election vote, register and vote, I think that says a great deal. We should be making this easier for people to access the ballot, not more difficult. And frankly, the amount of documentary evidence that this bill anticipates is extraordinary. I doubt that every Republican in the House has read through the amount of barriers and hurdles you would now have to register to vote.
Right, and when we're talking about military participate at a lower level anyway, right? They put their lives on the line, but because it's so difficult, they participate at about 27% points lower than the regular American voter. And you're going to make it harder for them? Really? So Native Americans, right? Native Americans are also targeted, in essence, by this bill. And we know that Native Americans in Arizona helped President Biden win that state. The Arizona law that was attempting to depressed that vote. One of the court cases I remember said it was like us taking a scalpel to the communities that helped fuel President Biden's win in Arizona, Native Americans and Latinos. You were in Arizona. You were in New Mexico, weren't you? So tell us some of the stories that you heard.
Well, look, I did, thank you for that. I released just today a report on voting for Native peoples, barriers and policy solutions. Not only did I spend time in Arizona and New Mexico meeting with tribal leaders and tribal members, but staff has spent a great deal of time traveling around the country. There are significant barriers to tribal residents voting, which are detailed in the report. I would encourage people to read it. I mean, these are the first Americans, and they have been treated, despite the Citizenship Act, which is, we celebrated its 100th passage and enactment, still enormous barriers. This will only make it more difficult, as you know, and tribal IDs will no longer be accepted because they don't meet the standard in the new bill in terms of registration.
Right, so Native Americans, the first Americans, right, who are clearly citizens, who didn't get the citizenship until about 100 years ago, and we're still making it hard? We are still making it hard? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record the report.
Without objection.
So, you know, it is just outrageous that we would do that. And then it hurts me a lot. I represent a rural district. And rural districts, like voting absentee and voting by mail is important in rural areas. You know, in November, the snow comes and a lot of people like to register and participate by mail and absentee. And it makes sense, right? And this will make that harder. Is that correct, Ranking Member?
Well, excuse me, it absolutely would. In many states, mail-in voting has been the standard for decades and decades without any alarm bells ringing that there's been any fraud involved. Arizona, 85% of voters vote by mail. States like Oregon and Colorado have long traditions of mail-in voting. If you're a rural resident in the United States, very often long distances between you and polling places. So mail, telephone, the internet, wherever possible, are the ways that you conduct your daily life. These will make most of these activities impossible as it relates to voting. So it just makes it, again, more difficult. It would prevent rural Americans from registering to vote by mail or online, requires an applicant to present documentary proof of citizenship in person at the office of an appropriate election official. That's in the bill. It would force millions of rural Americans who have registered to vote online or via mail to travel significant distance to present documents to government officials, something they currently have to do, they don't have to do, and have not had to do for decades now. And I do want to mention, 48% of Americans don't have passports, one of the forms of citizenship that the bill suggests. This is an insurmountable barrier to many people who would try to register for the first time, and it would burden rural voters who often have limited access to the types of government offices that you would find in urban settings that would help them access the documentary proof of citizenship, like passport services. So even if you wanted to get a passport, it's difficult to get to the offices. So it is voter suppression that targets rural Americans, hurts military personnel, hurts women who have changed their name as a result of marriage. I mean, students, you name it, the list is long of people who would be burdened by these new requirements.
And when we look at what was the coalition that led to the victory for Biden, these are the kinds of people, and this is the kind of voting that led to that, and they are under attack. You know, this week of, July 4th and celebrating freedom and democracy, democracy does not exist without strong voter participation, and it's shameful and unpatriotic when Republicans take aim at voter participation. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Ranking Member?
Well, just that, again, our goal ought to be to make sure every single American, every citizen in this country has access to the ballot. Sadly, too few do, too few participate, and putting more burdens on them is unacceptable if our goal is to make sure every single American is heard at the ballot box and that their votes count. That's what we ought to be focused on. I think that's what the Congress ought to be doing. That's what the Freedom to Vote Act does. That's why we offered it as amendment. Sadly, it wasn't deemed in order under the closed rule, but we'll keep fighting for it.
Right. And, you know, the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act used to be bipartisan. It passed 98-0 last time. And now Republicans have abandoned the Voting Rights Act. And that is once again in this month of celebrating our anniversary as a country that is founded on democracy. It is both shameful and unpatriotic. And I oppose this rule and bill. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.